like I said, this is a typical outfit that they would have worn. The hat is compliments to my mom. She wore it when she was a younger lady, especially when she went out picking stones. God, I hated that job.
You introduce me yet, or?
This is fitted in the back so that
How do
the
we get
dust
people
wouldn't
out of
come
the Zoom?
up. And I have to take it off because I always feel like a horse. You can't see side by side,
Yeah,
so I
men
have
and
to
the
take
men,
it
not
off.
here. How do we get them to stop
And
sharing
this
this
comes
screen?
off this way
Stop the-
and has stays in it. So when it got dirty, all you had to do was pull the stays out and throw it in your wash machine. Now, as far as the apron. Anyway. As far as the apron, when I ordered it, I got it and I thought, what's with this? I don't have a thing that goes around my neck. Why is that?
Going through right
So I did a little research. And I found out that it wasn't proper etiquette to receive visitors in your cabin or whatever with a dirty apron. Now, women, you all know when you have an apron on, you wipe your hands here. I mean, that's automatic. So they would put pins on. They'd pull the pins off. The top would flop down and would cover up the dirty part of your apron. And so therefore, they could use the apron over and over. Now, I have to acknowledge this piece of wood here, otherwise I will forget. This was just given to me when I came in by Mr.
Gaspard.
Who lived very close to Tornado Park. This is in his woods. He says he has huge tree stumps that were remainders of the Peshtigo fire that went through. And he gave me this so I could use it as a prop, which I very much appreciate. When I do talk about Williamsonville, and I will later on, it is the tornado area, so the Tornado Park area. That was called Williamsonville. All right, and they changed the name because of what they constitute a tornado of fire that went through there. Okay. Now, I still refer to it as the Peshtigo Fire. I have a hard time saying Great Fire of 1871 because my grandfather lived with us and he always referred to it as the Peshtigo Fire because they firmly believed that embers from the Peshtigo side flew over the water and ignited it on this side, which is not true. It is two distinct fires that happen on the same night because of the dry conditions and the wind coming up from the south going this way. So it's humanly impossible for debris to go this way over the bay when the wind is coming this way. But they didn't know that. They believed it was from one side to the other. So they called it the Peshtigo Fire. It was started basically because of human carelessness. It was, by the way, I'm sure you all know it was the same night as the Chicago Fire. Chicago Fire was minuscule compared to the loss of lives on this side. I mean, on both sides. The Peshtigo side, needless to say, had more because they had like a little village, Peshtigo. Whereas on our side, it was scattered. Farmers here, there, not all in one concentrated area. It had been very, very dry for not much snow in the wintertime before. Very little, maybe a little rain in July, but that was about it. It was so dry that you could walk across the swamps and not get your feet wet. So it was not unusual for people to say they would see something like a little snake going down in the peat moss in the wood, in the forest. And that was actually fire burning underneath the ground. And it would hit a tree and it would ignite and the tree would fall down. My grandfather also told me, and this is coming from his father who lived through the fire, that there was sightings of like huge balloons of gas, big ones, you'd say, floating along the tops of the trees. They were like big black balloons. They would hit a tree or a building and would explode and send fire shards in all directions, consequently setting off more fires. And this was not unusual, according to modern firefighters. When a fire gets hot enough, it forms its own gases. And so this is what they saw. Okay, firefighters now believe that the fire started because of, like I said, the wind coming up from the south, all these little fires that had been started because of human carelessness. See, the way that they got rid of the branches of the trees that they cut down, they burn them. That was the fastest way to get rid of them. The way they clear land, if they got rid of the bigger trees, they burn them. On the Peshtigo side, they did the same thing. They had more of an access to that because there was a railroad being built from Green Bay up. And the railroad workers would get more money if they could get into the finished product before the due time. So they were careless. They just threw the branches anywhere and burned them. They could not also float the logs that they had cut down the rivers because the rivers were almost dry. So there was a lot of different things. Sawdust. They couldn't get rid of sawdust because there was no place to put it. And they piled it up. They used it for to keep the dust down. They used it in their mattresses. They used it everywhere. Everything was governed by trees and wood of some sort. After the fire, they found out that this changed the whole agricultural thing in the area. Instead of cutting down trees, they farmed. And I'll tell you a little bit later on about the buildings that they built. It was also, because it's the 1st of October, this is why this is National Fire Prevention Weeks. It's because of these 3 fires. And there were more fires burning. There was fires in Michigan, there was fires in Minnesota. But for the purpose of this talk, it's just on these 2 areas. Between the 2, they figured it was between, about 2,000 people that died. I have heard. The exact number is not known because on our side, there was many people that just wandered in, got their patent for their land in Green Bay, came in, and they were isolated because there are trees all around. And so you went in, you squatted, you cleared your land, and you stayed to yourself. Native Americans, they have no idea how many Native Americans died because those 2 were not accounted for anywhere. So that's loosely what it is. As far as acreage burned, there is about, a little over 2,000 acres. So it was a huge, huge fire. In fact, it's still listed as the worst natural fire in the United States. It's one of the worst ones that there's been. So you have to take all this into consideration and think, how in the heck did we do it? It wasn't like you could get on the phone and call Salvation Army or the Red Cross. No one was going to come to your assistance. You were there. Now think of how you would feel if you had to be in this position. Here you are. You've got your little land cleared, and all around you are trees. The roads are corduroy roads, which are logs placed side by side. So they burn too. You were caught. You were more or less had to pray like the Dickens that the good Lord was going to save you, because that was the only one that was there. There was no getting around. And to make matters worse, an itinerant preacher had gone through both sides. And guess what? He was preaching the end of the world was coming. And guess how it was coming? By fire. So some people didn't even bother trying to save themselves. They just knelt down, probably put their hands up to the sky and prayed. It was a whole natural collaboration of events that happened. Now, I was fortunate enough to have my grandfather living with us. And there's nothing that made me happier than when he'd say, I'll talk about the old times. And we'd sit by his feet and he would start talking. Now I wish like heck I remember all the things he said, because he was a logger. And boy, he had some really juicy stories about logging. And I can't remember a lot of them. I remember a thing here and there. But he was the one that passed down our side of the Peshtigo Fire. It's surprising that not many people, if I ask somebody, I have to be careful, because I say some, the older generation, I'm getting there, so I have to watch it. I ask some of the older people, what were you told? And they said, they never talked about it. It was sort of like someone going into a war that's coming back and they just want to forget it. They didn't want anything to do with it. I think of how I've taken care of people that have been burned, and they are in excruciating pain. What did they have for pain relievers? Who knows? I know darn well they didn't have any antibiotics, and those burns get infected real fast. People get dehydrated real fast. And what was not even on the, as far as physical, mentally, they probably saw their loved ones burned right in front of them. If you ever go to Peshtigo and you go to the fire museum, make sure you go into the cemetery. The cemetery is much more, see, my Belgian comes out every now and then. It's more interesting than, I think, than the museum, because they have tombstones. And next to the tombstone, they have little plaques that tell you how that person died. Like, for instance, they have these tall tombstones that are square on one side. They have a family name on each side. And what it basically says on that little plaque is, there's no one buried here. We couldn't find any remains, but they were families, and we wanted the world to know they existed. There's another one that says, this farmer, because there was a sugar bush, it was called, away from Peshtigo, he saw the fire approaching, and he buckled up his family, put them in a buckboard, harnessed the horses, and went pell-mell towards the city, towards Peshtigo, thinking they would be safe. But the horses weren't harnessed real well in his haste, so he had to stop and reharness them. And while he was here at the front, his family was in the back of the buckboard, and one of these big balloons that I mentioned hit the buckboard and burned his whole family right in front of his eyes. So that's one of the plaques. It's just unfathomable. Every time I do this and I do more research, I get more amazed at the resiliency of these people, how they came back, the terrible things they had been through. It's almost unfathomable. Now, I am going to do a reenactment of my great-grandmother. Her name is Emmerence Gaspard Englebert. She lived in 1871. She was a young married woman at that time. And that was my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather. And they survived, as you will hear in my reenactment, in a well. Now, they were fortunate because they survived in the well. A lot of people that went down into the well, the fire came along and the fire needed so much oxygen, it took out all the oxygen in the air and they suffocated. They had nothing more to breathe in. Some people looked like they were sleeping because they took in deep breaths to try to breathe. It burned their lungs. A lot of people couldn't see after them because of all the debris and the things flying in the air and going in their eyes. I sort of simulate that to, I took care of people with welder's flashes from the shipyards, sort of like that. Their eyes just were so painful from looking at this bright light. So I am going to be Emmerence Gaspard Englebert. And the part I tell you about Williamsonville is taken from a passage that was written by Mr. Frank Tilton. He was the editor of, I want to say the Press Gazette, but I don't think it was called that then. It was a Green Bay paper. That is the only actual written narrative of what happened on our side. Many things are written from the Peshtigo side because it was a little bit more, what should I say? I don't want to say educated, a little bit more knowledgeable about ways on the outside because they could speak to Green Bay. They eventually got a telegraph and stuff like that, but we didn't. We couldn't read or write English. And so our stories were mainly handed down from person to person. But this Mr. Tilton went in and talked to Thomas Williamson, who was one of the founders of Williamsonville, which was a shingle mill where Tornado Park is. Okay. And while I'm talking that, so I don't forget, Tornado Park, the old highway, DK, goes right across an area called the Potato Patch, which you'll hear about when I do my narrative. When they put up DK, they didn't do any archaeological digs at that time. So they went right over, they didn't look for anything. When they put in the new highway, I'm sure you guys remember that they had little plots that they were doing digs to see if there was anything there because there were people buried on that area. So it's like a cemetery, but they never really found the exact places where they were buried. So, all right. Hi, I'm Emmerence Gaspard Englebert. I am married to Desire Englebert. We both came over from Belgium. I was just a young girl when I came over. I came with my father and my brothers, and we went through Green Bay. And Pa said, okay, let's gather. We're going to go into our land. I looked around and I didn't see anything to transport us. Pa said, we're going to walk. So we walked from Green Bay till we got to our little plot, not very far from what is now Brussels. And Pa came up and said, okay, we're home. I looked around. I didn't see a home. I saw nothing but trees, giant trees. I looked up, I couldn't even see the sun. It was like a green canopy, a curtain across the sky. I thought, this can't be. But Pa said, yes, this is where it was. So he started getting together branches and making like a little lean-to for us while my brother started clearing the land. I was frightened. You see, I had heard about Indians and wild animals. I didn't want this to be my home, but it was. And the Indians proved to be very friendly. They taught us how to tan the hides, tap the maple trees, where to fish. We got along quite well. I got older and we had a little house established. Pa was planting his crops around the stumps. We couldn't dig the stumps up, so we didn't have oxen. So Pa and the boys pulled their implements by themselves, snagging the roots in the rocks every now and then. But the crops grew, and when they were ready to be harvested, they would put the oats in a bag, and I would put it on my head and let the bag out the back and walk to the nearest grist mill, which happened to be in Dykesville. It was a long walk, and it was really, really treacherous because we followed Indian paths, and we had to weave our way through the forest, looking at trees that had bark pulled off, because that's the only way we could tell if we were still on the track. And in the back of my mind, I remember a Mrs. Seraphin Lamper who was attacked by wolves while she was going. So that would always be in the back of my mind. Another woman froze to death because she had gotten off the path. But I made it back and forth quite a few times, so we had our flour ground so we could make bread. As I got older, I happened to notice that a few farms down, there was a home with 6 boys. And one of them was quite good looking. And he could read and write English. Oh, that was really, really plus. So we started courting. We were saving money to buy our own land. And then suddenly, like a recession hit, and there wasn't any money anywhere. The shingle mills, we couldn't do anything. It was just money dried up. So Desire decided he was going to leave and weave his way back to Chicago. Worked in the brickyards, came back, and while he was gone, I thought, what happens if he doesn't come back? What are we going to do? But he came back and he had money, and he gave some money to his folks and saved some for us. We bought some more land. I was really thrilled about having my own land. And then I looked around. It was all trees. I had to start all over again. But little by little, we cleared them. We made ourselves a home. Had a barn. Had a few implements. By working in the shingle mills and our crops, we bought ourselves oxen, a pair of oxen. So things were looking up. Our first child was born. His name was Eugene, a strapping young man. So I was looking forward to the Kermis. The Kermis was coming. It was going to be on October 8th. Oh, I had made pies. The Koismans, our neighbors, had made their Belgian brew. Oh, they made good beer. We were getting all set for the Kermis. You see, Kermis means church mass, which is a celebration of the harvest. And every little village had one. And so it was our turn. But there had been fires burning all around. We could see them. We heard stories about a grist mill going up in flames, in ashes. We heard about roads that were no longer there because they were burned. Some days it was the smoke was so thick, we had to walk around with cloths over our noses in order to breathe. Ashes and embers came floating down like snowflakes, hitting the shingle. So Desire had to run with his pail of water up on the roof to try to douse them. We had kept ahead of it. So I felt pretty good about everything. I couldn't wait to go to the Kermis. It would be so nice to just have a little fun. I was all set to go, but Desire came in and said, no, Emmerence, we're not going. The fire's coming. The fire's coming. I said, what do you mean? He said, grab Eugene. We're going down into the well. It's coming closer and closer. We have to get there. Take your woolen blanket and off we go. I looked around. I wanted to take something from the house that would remind me of home. He said, no time. Just take Eugene and down the well we go. As we went running into the well, we came out and there were wild animals coming into our clearing. They were mixing with the oxen. Birds were falling out of the sky. The noise was terrific and the fire kept coming closer and closer and closer. You could hear the roar and the smoke was unbearable. We went down into the well and we took little Eugene and passed him side by side so he wouldn't get burned as embers came down into that well. I prayed the rosary and I prayed the rosary all night. In the morning, we called up, looked around. Nothing was left. Nothing was left of our farm. Nothing was left, just the clothes on our backs. What were we going to do? Winter was coming. We didn't know where to go. We looked to the east and here were the Huysmans coming. They looked like scepters of death. Their eyes were red and glazed and scared. And they came over and we talked and we didn't know where to go. We did remember that we had planted carrots and turnips and potatoes. So we went and dug up in our garden so we had a little something to eat. And then we waited. As we waited, we kept hearing stories about different places and different people. Brussels, for instance, had just about their whole village burned. Forceful also went up in smoke. And the people of Forceful ran into the river to save themselves. One gentleman went out into the plowed fields so that he could save himself, figuring that since that was already cleared that the fire wouldn't have anything to feed on. But that wasn't so. One farmer took his pig because his pig was pregnant and his family, and that was a good thing to save. He didn't have any water, so he used his beer, and that worked too. But there were just one tragedy after another. We did hear about a miracle, though, that happened at Champion, where the fire came up to a little chapel that was consecrated ground because a woman, Adele Bryce, had seen the Blessed Virgin there. And the local settlers would come and pray, and they had the consecrated ground around it. And when the fire came, they all went running in that direction and proceeded to pray the rosary. The fire came up to the doors, split, and went around on the other side. It was like an oasis of green. The saddest story I heard was a little village called Williamsonville. I know where it was. It was habited with about 70 people or so. And I heard of the 70, only 17 or so survived. It had been there for quite a while. It was a shingle, a lumber mill. And they had a boarded house, different houses for the Mrs. Williamson and her whole family. And it was on about 10 acres of land. They too had been following the fire. They too thought they'll be able to beat it. They'll be able to stop it. Not so. Nothing prepared them for this. Thomas Williamson went running into his mother's cabin and said, "Mother, put on woolen skirts, put on woolen pants. Quick, do that." She did, but his sisters didn't because they were young and they didn't want other people to see them in woolen articles of clothing, but should have done it. You see, I heard later that women's clothes with their petticoats and their natural body fat burn faster. It would the fire would get a hold of them and wrap their clothes around their bodies, and it would be like a candle, and they'd go up and float in smoke, cremated right on the spot, nothing left except a pile of ashes. So the Williamsons came and they went running around with their buckets, putting out water and putting out fires with their water, figuring that they could save themselves. 7 of them went down into the well. The bottom 5 lived, the top 2 died. Mrs. Williamson and a group of 35 people went running to the potato patch. They too figured that since it had already been cultivated, that it would burn. They put the women and children in the middle, the men on the outside with their blankets, and awaited their fate. In the morning, all 35 were dead, burned beyond recognition, some without arms, some without legs. It was a terrible, terrible sight. Mrs. Williamson was running in that direction too, but for some reason she stopped. She saw a few stones and she put her feet in the stones and covered herself up and squatted down. Twice she had to push burning bodies away because they were going to ignite her blanket. And she said it was terrible because she could hear the gristle of the fat on the women and on the men as they were being burned. She said it was just terrible. In the morning, she slowly got up, called out, and her son Thomas did answer. But in the horizon, in the corner of the camp, there were 2 men that were trying to kill themselves because they were burned so bad they didn't want to live. They were hitting themselves against stones, hoping that something would kill them so that they didn't have to endure the pain anymore. Thomas and Mrs. Williamson started walking to Sturgeon Bay. When they got there, the good people of Sturgeon Bay was preparing for the fire because they could see it approaching. But you see, on October 9th, it rained. And so that put out some of the fire, along with the wind apparently coming from a different direction. I don't understand that at all, but they got to Sturgeon Bay, and the people of Sturgeon Bay had put supplies in a buckboard and were going to go into Williamsonville. They didn't get very far. The roads were gone. There was nothing in its path except downed trees, dead animals, carcasses of people that probably will never be identified. So they put their supplies on their back and went in. When they got there, he said, no pen can describe what I saw or smelled. No, nobody could write that. They proceeded to number the bodies and bury them, hoping that someday someone would acknowledge their existence. We started getting supplies from other areas of the country. You see, it was the Chicago fire, and the world was fixated on Chicago. And Mrs. Fairchild, Lucius Fairchild was the governor at this time, and he was on his way to Chicago with a trainload of supplies. Mrs. Fairchild did something that no woman has ever done. She commandeered the next train load that was to go to Chicago and says, you're not going to Chicago. You're staying here to help our people. So we started getting supplies from there. The people of this country were very generous. They started sending seeds and they started sending implements. You see, it was winter, but we had to make a little shelters, or the fire was really freaky, and the way that it burned here, but it didn't burn there. And so a few houses did survive. Multiple families lived in these houses, but then they were afraid of smallpox, diphtheria, all the bad things that you can get by living in close proximity to so many people. The government did give us money. They had provisions. But you know, you couldn't just get a provision because you went up and said, I had something burned in the fire. You had to prove what you had burned. Having a fence burned didn't count. You had to make sure that you had burned a significant amount of stuff. And then you had to work for it. You weren't just going to get it handed to you. You had to work. You had to prove that you were doing something. 6 months later, in May, the government said, that's it, you're off the government dole. With your own good right arm, you go out and earn a living. And so that's what we did. We went out and earned a living. We looked around. All those big trees were gone. Yes, they were still, some stumps were still there and some parts of the trees, but the bigger trees were gone. We could farm. That's what we came here for. That's what we came from Belgium, to be farmers and to own our own land. We were going to build houses too. Huh. But we weren't building them of logs anymore. We were building them of brick. Lots of clay in this area, so we built them the clay and we got red brick. We also put little portholes. You know, in the gables of the roof, there are little round windows on some of our houses. And that's so that the owner could climb up to the highest point in their house and look out to see if another fire was coming, because they didn't want to get caught anymore. As the days progressed, more and more farmers got their homes built and their land tilled, and their families grew. And we became a prosperous county. Thank you. Got a little bit, I got quite a bit of time left. What can I do for you? Any questions? Oh, come on, there's got to be some questions. I didn't blab on for nothing.
Have you ever heard of the theory of meteorites?
Yep. Yes.
It happened all at the same time. The balls of fire that some people saw, rather than being just chemical, could have been from that happened at the same time.
As
One of the, it's just a theory, unless you had a photograph of it.
I don't have a photograph. It's a theory that, yes, people have said that, but modern firefighters have studied this fire, because it was said that it was straight line winds. The winds pulled in the heat. More the heat and the winds, they needed more oxygen, and it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And one of the firefighters I talked to said it was like being on the end of a blowtorch. That's how hot it got. And the winds were sometimes 100 to 200 miles an hour, blowing in every direction possible. The tornado of fire that they talked about was exactly I can see why they said that. It looks like a tornado, it like a swirling thin thing that goes up and about. That, according to this gentleman, was on the perimeters of this straight line winds effect. And that caused a lot of havoc. There are all kinds of different theories, and I go to schools, or I used to. One little boy in Corpus Christi, I said, do you know about the Peshtigo Fire? And he raised his little hand and he says, yes, I do. And I said, well, how do you know? He said, at October 8th, at supper time, we have a moment of silence because we had relatives that died in the fire. And I thought, carrying that all this time, that was pretty good. I can't even imagine. Think of the terror you would have had. Another thing that helped them get even more frightened. The Belgians are predominantly a Catholic heritage. And Father James was one of the founders of Bay Settlement Parish. He's the reason why actually the Belgians came here in the first place, because the first group came in 1853 and they were going to settle in Sheboygan. No, all the good land was taken. So then they came down, they heard about this French-speaking city called Green Bay. So they came down to Green Bay, left their women and children at Green Bay, and they went to Kokona. We were gonna be living in Kokona. Came back, and one of the children had died. And so the funeral mass was being said, and Father James was helping officiate, and he could speak French, which is a very close simile of Walloon. And so he had already started a little settlement around Champion. So he convinced them to go to Champion. In fact, there's a monument there that says En Première Belge, which means the first Belgians. And that's where they settled. In 1854, another group came over. And that group, everyone was so happy to see each other because most of these came from the same villages. I mean, it was like, I went and then a year later, my neighbor from Belgium came over. They brought cholera. And so they not only wiped themselves out, they took care of some of the people that were already here. In 1856 was the greatest concentration of Belgians that came over. And that was ones that settled around in their area. That's where my family's from. We still have, my family still has the farm that they settled on. We sold the buildings, but the land we still have. That well was there when I grew up. My dad would say, don't go over there. That's where Grandma, I guess it would have been to him, Grandma and Grandpa almost saved themselves by going down into that well. And so it's, besides the Peshtigo Fire, I'm going to do a little excerpt because this always gets chuckles from people. Kermis, because it's a Kermis time of year. All right, Kermis. The first Kermis was in Rosaire, and it was started because a woman was just plain tired of working all the time. She had it. She let her husband know, and I guess according to no uncertain terms, this was not going to keep going on. And so they decided they were going to have a kermis. All right. So then from there, all these little villages, everyone knows about kermises, although they're not like it was when we were growing up. Now they're basically bar time and not family time. But back in the old days, our Heritage Center in Nemours is the birthplace of the Norbertine Fathers for the United States, who went on to establish St. Norbert's College. That is where they started, okay? So he was there getting his little mission started, and Bishop Melcher said, you can't they cannot sing and dance on Sunday. 3 days Kermit, you can't sing and dance on Sunday. That went over like a lead balloon. They went right ahead and sang and danced. Oh, Bishop Melcher was really upset. So he said, go tell them they're all excommunicated. They're no longer Catholics. All righty. So that went on for about a month or so. And Reverend Pennings went up and said, you know, Bishop, you want me to spread the word of the Lord? There's no one in church. You want me to build a few more missions? Like I said, there's no one in church, there's no money. All right, he said. So wham, everybody was back in the church. I mean, you know, what the heck? I could go on. Oh, I could go on and on. I'm deviating from the Peshtigo Fire because you guys don't have any questions.
So, wait,
Yes,
so sheer coincidence.
Yep.
that both sides of the bay, same night, massive fires.
yeah. It happened. And the Chicago Fire too.
Right.
Oh.
Well, I can see that. I mean, there's a distance there. and
But
there's
no,
a
it was,
distance here,
and
but
it was the same wind that came up, the same human carelessness, because they had been burning
right.
things on both sides. I know it sounds a little hokey, but honest to God, that's what happened. Yes,
So when it came to the Chicago fire, there's always the story about the cow, right? Right. And then even with the Peshtigo fire, for a long time, there was a story that it was, it was one major thing. But then kind of answering in part this question here, when people went back to take a look at the accounts, they realized that there was multiple burnings that were happening at this time. People were burning the remnants of crops and trees, and that created so many pockets that essentially it allowed multiple fires to start at once. So, and it just coincided with this time of year when everything is drier and all that. So, but this is actually a different question. There is kind of this, all of Wisconsin, there was often some ethnic tensions between different groups of people that came, Dutch, Belgian, German, Polish. Did this fire and the results of that change any of those kind of relationships, maybe more to the positive, or were some of those negative sentiments still there?
I don't believe it made any difference because, especially in our area, there's a Colberg is right in the middle of the German enclave, and we've always gotten along. We had never, and I never heard my family say anything different. Over here, the Flemish and the Walloon get along real well. Belgium is a small country and it's divided by linguistic lines. The Walloons are on the southern part and they're more blue collar. The Flemish are on the upper part and they're more the intellectual, part. And in Belgium, I've been over there a few times and we stay in families over there. And I said, gee, I'd really like to see Bruges, because Bruges I've heard is a beautiful city, and it is. We went over and he looked at me and said, oh, you want to go there? I went, oh, yes, I do. So there's animosity even now between those two, but that never happened here. And you can usually tell the Flemish on this side is a lot of their names start with Van, because it's sort of the Dutch German. We're closer to the French line, like Van Ginger Italian. That was shortened to Vandertime. But that's their Flemish. You can sort of pick that out, but there wasn't any of that animosity in here.
Were there any Belgians involved in the Civil War, soldiers?
Yes, but we were also involved in two riots. One went to Green Bay and one went to Kewanee. There's a there was a mistaken thought, again, because we couldn't understand English, that the Belgians were being drafted in more number than the rest of the nationalities. So they ended up going with pitchforks to Kiwani to confront the election board. And they, the guy who was head of it, heard they were coming. So like a good, brave man, he took off and he left his wife in the store to confront these angry people. But when they got there, someone that could speak English and Belgian explained to them how they did that. And so they were happy. They went home and then the husband came back with a group of troops, and there was no one there to confront it because everyone was gone home. And another group went to Green Bay. They were going to for the same thing, and they got there, and someone explained to them, and they went home. But it said in the paper, we wanted to see how many people were at this riot, and they told us they couldn't tell because all the men were in church praying. So there were, yes, there were quite a few, but I am not real sure. If you ever get a chance to hear John Mertens talk, he's done a whole thing on the Belgians in the Civil War. It's really quite interesting. In fact, if you want to, we have a big thing coming up at the Heritage Center. The Heritage Center, by the way, is, you don't know, is a decommissioned Catholic church. And it was built in 1893. And we have it because the people in the area wanted it. The bishop was going to knock it down. It already knocked down the rectory, so the church was the next on the chopping block. And the people in the area, the old parishioners said, you can't do that. This is our church, this is who we are. And so the diocese said, okay, fine. But you've got a month. So they decided they could raise $20,000. In a month's time, they knew that the farmers wanted the church. And so they raised 40,000. And so we kept the church. And it's a night, we're having a big, I don't want to say celebration, that's the wrong word, a commemoration this weekend, the 8th, 9th, and 10th of the Peshtigo Fire.
An interesting tidbit about the Peshtigo Fire connecting to World War II. They realized in Japan the bombing was very inaccurate because the B-29s were so high. They studied the Peshtigo Fire, and that's what caused the Americans to do the incendiary bombing in Japan, because they realized if the firestorm is like a blast furnace, once it gets ignited in a large area, it kind of consumes itself. And Tokyo was mostly wooden buildings, so there were actually more people killed in Tokyo than the atomic bomb on Hiroshima.
I think the same thing with Dresden also. Yeah, Dresden was another one that was a firestorm. There are some really good books. Firestorms of Peshtigo is one. The Brown County Historical Society just put out one. And we have it at the Heritage Center. I said at the Great Fires of 1871, I think is the name of it. And the other one, if you're from close to Kiwani, Virginia Fell Johnson just wrote a book, The Night It Rained Like Rained Hell. And that's all about the Kiwani side, because it's not so much that it burned on that particular day, but because these fires were burning months, it was devastation all along into Kiwani, almost up to Two Rivers. So, yes.
Two questions. We're from the southern part of the state, so we don't have as much information as a lot of people here. How close is the two closest points across the bay? Peshtigo and the closest point on this side.
Boy, anybody guys know that?
Probably about 20 miles.
It's about right. Yeah, it sounds about right.
Green Island is 16.4 miles from here, and I think Green Island is halfway. Okay, so,
I know at Green Isle, they were, could see the fires burning and their foghorns were going all day and ships could not see where they were going. They dropped anchor because the smoke was so thick.
Well, the ship's actually rammed up on the island, even with the foghorns blaring constantly. That's how thick the smoke was.
I know in the fire at Tillamook, Oregon, that sent up a smoke from about 32,000 feet. And it changed the climate out there for a year and a half to 2 years, at least by what I've read. Was there a climate change here that you know of at all?
They didn't mention anything. I don't remember reading anything about it, and no one has ever told me about a drastic climate change. They just said they went on like they usually did. No, that's a good question. It makes sense that it would be. Anything else? Yes. Man in the back. Oh.
You talked about psychological effects, not just the damage physically, but the psychological effects. How did that affect the community? You mentioned that they built houses specifically designed to prevent that happening again, but were there people that left and just
Yes.
they couldn't bear to be there anymore?
Yes, in fact, that's why eastern part of Green Bay got populated. Some of the people in that part, like the Red River area, these poor souls said, I can't do it anymore. I just can't. And so they went to Green Bay and they started in the canning factory. Well, there weren't canning factories there, but they started with crops, like vegetable crops and so forth, and built their red brick houses. In fact, Curly Lambeau lived in a red brick house. By the way, he's Belgian. Did you know that? Yep. Julius Bellin is Belgian, from Bellin Hospital. Joannes from Joannes Park, he's Belgian. So, good stock. Anything else?
before everybody goes, I just want to make a quick announcement. November 4th is our next speaker series. Dan Hebler is going to be here. I don't know if anybody's ever seen him here in the past. He's a very interesting character storyteller, and he will be talking about the gales of November and various stories that relate to that. So, same time, same place. We appreciate those of you that made food donations. We will take those over to Lakeshore Cat Food Pantry tomorrow. And your financial donations will go to the museum and help us bring the speaker series to you. So thank you very much.
And thank you all for coming in this torrential rain.